My name is Juan González. I was a longtime journalist. I've spent 40 years in the commercial journalism field, 30 of those years as a staff columnist at the New York Daily News. And I'm currently the Richard Hefner Professor of Public Policy and the Media at the Rutgers University Department of Journalism and Media Studies. I've also had a long history as an activist in the Puerto Rican and Latino community, was one of the founders of the Young Lords in the 1970s and of the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights in the 1980s, and was also a founding member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and served as its president from 2002 to 2004. I served as the Andrés Bello Chair at NYU in the fall of 2015. I had been recommended by Professor Aline Davila, a well-known Latino professor throughout the United States, who I have known for many years. And I didn't previously have a relationship with NYU other than having spoken at several events in the journalism and communications department there at NYU, but no previous experience with the university. I had been the Bell Zeller visiting professor at Brooklyn College back in 2000 to 2002, but before this, I had no relationship with NYU to speak of. And it was Arlene Davila who convinced me, said, Juan, you should definitely apply for this position. And I didn't really think of it at the time as something that I wanted to do, but she convinced me, and it turned out to be a wonderful experience. So while I was the Andrés Bello Chair, I sort of developed a pretty ambitious set of programs that I had hoped to organize at NYU. I did 2 public lectures at the university, and just so happened that my period there was just around the time of the debt crisis that exploded in Puerto Rico. So my first public lecture was on the Puerto Rican debt crisis. And as a direct manifestation of the colonial condition of Puerto Rico, the unresolved colonial condition of Puerto Rico. And it was really just at the start of the debt crisis. And I think that my lecture there had a lot of resonance beyond just the NYU community. I also did a public lecture on the Tribunes of the People, the radical Latino journalists in the United States, including Ricardo Flores Magón, Jovita Hidar, and Jesus Colón. Of course, Ricardo Flores Magón was the great anarchist, publisher, and editor who is considered really one of the forerunners of the Mexican Revolution of 1910, and who ended up dying in a federal prison because the United States government, together with the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship, was constantly hounding Ricardo Flores Magón and his 2 brothers. I also spoke about the tremendous work that Jovita Hidar, a Mexican-American journalist in Laredo, Texas, did, crusading against segregation in the public schools of Texas, against the lynching of Mexicans, and for equal rights for the Mexican community. And of course, Jesus Colón, the famous writer and activist in New York City, member of the Communist Party, who wrote a regular column for many years about life in New York City among the Puerto Rican and other Latinos of the city. So I basically tried to resurrect the radical tradition that existed among Latinos here, among Latino journalists in the United States that are mostly forgotten. So those were the 2 lectures, and I had 3 public conversations during that period of time. One was on the legacy of the Young Lords for the Latino community of this time, and was able to bring together both scholars who have studied and written about the Young Lords, and also former Young Lord members themselves who have written about the organization. Johanna Fernandez was one of the scholars who was then working on her volume that just came out last year, and actually has won 3 prizes from the Organization of American Historians as one of the best history books of 2020. And she was in the midst of finishing that book at the time. So that was one public conversation I did on the Young Lords. I did another public conversation expanding the narrative, looking into the role of Chicano and Puerto Rican studies in the American universities and the origins of both Puerto Rican and Chicano studies and their impact on the lexicon of knowledge at these universities. And finally, I think the biggest event and the biggest hit was the public conversation I had of Latino performing artists and their community. And I was able to bring together Lin-Manuel Miranda and Sonia Manzano, who for 30 years was a major figure on Sesame Street, one of the key characters on Sesame Street. And we filled the Skirball Auditorium there at NYU. Over 700 people attended the event. And interestingly, when I tried to get Lin-Manuel, because I'd met Lin-Manuel, I knew him off and on, but the one I really knew his father very well. His father was a close friend of mine. So at the time, of course, Hamilton had not yet opened on Broadway. It had opened in the public theater previously, but it hadn't opened on Broadway. And so I called up Luis Miranda, his father. I said, Luis, I need a favor. I want to organize this event, this big event at NYU. And I think if Lin-Manuel would agree to come with Sonia Manzano, it would be a big hit. And so Luis told me, well, Juan, a lot of people don't know that both I and my wife were students, graduate students at New York University. And in fact, that Lin-Manuel was just a baby when we were living in the graduate dorms at NYU. So Lin-Manuel has a direct connection to NYU. Not only that, but our daughter graduated from the Stern Business School, and she's the chief financial officer of our company. So basically the entire Miranda family has a direct and long-standing relationship to NYU. So she said, so I'm sure Lin-Manuel will do it. And he talked to him, and sure enough, he showed up, and it was a tremendous event. It was a wonderful conversation. And especially it was inspirational to all of the theater and performing arts students at NYU who showed up that night and had some excellent questions and were thrilled to be in the presence of the person who arguably has revolutionized the American theater in just less than a decade. So I think that was the high point of my tenure there as the Andrés Bello Chair. In addition to the public events that I held for the general campus community and the public, I also taught a course, a graduate colloquium titled Forgotten Chronicles, 200 Years of News Reporting on the United States by Latinos. And here I tried to look at this hidden history of the United States in terms of the Latino press that most people don't know. There's a rich history going back to El Mississippi in 1808, the first Spanish language newspaper in the United States, to Padre Felix Varela, the great Cuban revolutionary's paper, El Habanero in Philadelphia in the 1820s, to the El Ranchero in the 1850s in San Antonio, to La Estrella and other papers in California in the 1850s and 60s. There's a long history of Latino journalists writing about the United States and the conditions, not just of the Latino community, but of the general American community. For instance, Jose Marti. Most people forget that Jose Marti spent 16 years writing in the United States about events in the United States for Latin American newspapers. And Jose Marti, of course, is not only was a great revolutionary and the founding father considered of Cuba, but he was also one of the most magnificent writers that you can imagine. Unfortunately, since everything he wrote was in Spanish for the most part, very little of his extraordinary reporting on everything from the Haymarket Square massacre to the genocidal wars against the Native Americans, to lynchings in the South of African Americans. He wrote about all of those things, to the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge. He wrote an article on the first day that the Brooklyn Bridge was opened about this marvel of American engineering. So that I tried to bring out some of this reporting that was done right here in the United States by Latino writers, but with most Americans are not aware of, and unfortunately, most public and university libraries never archived their production, so that much of the production has been lost or is not readily available to the average American or the average scholar. So I try to teach my students about this rich history and this legacy. My students were literally shocked to discover that there was such a rich legacy of Latino journalism right here in the United States. I think that unfortunately, young people, even the brightest of them, believe that the world was just invented when they discovered it, and they don't really understand the historical antecedents of any process. And for instance, even on issues of immigration, I exposed them to the great radio announcer, Pedro Gonzalez, who back in the 1930s had a radio show in Southern California, in the Los Angeles area. Pedro Gonzalez was a famous singer of the time. And he had a show called Los Madrugadores. And basically his group would sing to the farm workers, starting from 4 o'clock in the morning as the farm workers were heading out into the fields. He had a radio show that was producing music for them. But in the 1930s, as the Hoover administration began the first massive deportation program in the midst of the Depression against Mexicans, Pedro Gonzalez turned his radio show into the first effort to document the unjustified deportations of Mexicans from the United States. And as a result, he ended up being jailed on a bogus rape charge. He was sentenced to San Quentin prison, where he ended up organizing all of the inmates of San Quentin into the first general strike of prisoners in the California penal system for reforms. And he spent several years in prison until the public campaign to free him actually bore fruit when the young woman he was accused of raping recanted her testimony and testified that she had been put up to lying by the Los Angeles district attorney. So the result was that Pedro Gonzalez was freed from prison, but he was immediately deported to Mexico. And thousands of people lined the railroad tracks as his train was heading to take him back to Mexico. And he ended up living out the rest of his life in Tijuana as a radio announcer, still broadcasting into the United States, but from Mexico because he was excluded from the United States. So Pedro Gonzalez is one of the early journalists who fought racism and anti-immigrant xenophobia in the United States, but is largely forgotten these days. There was a PBS documentary that came out on him about 15 years ago, but for the most part, he's forgotten in terms of journalism history in the United States. So I think the students were pleasantly surprised to find out that there's a long history here of Latinos fighting to be included in the American narrative, and also to standing up for injustice, against injustice. And I think that that's what my course attempted to do. My period at NYU as the Andrés Bello Chair really first began to get me to thinking about a career in academia. Until that, as I said, I'd been a working journalist for more than 40 years. But at a certain point, the journalism industry in America was rapidly declining in terms of the old legacy media, print, radio, cable, and newspapers. And unfortunately, the new media in America, the pay scales and the job security and all the other things you associate with a decent paying job don't exist in new media. It's basically young people working with no benefits, with little pay. So I began to think that it was time to leave the commercial or mainstream media. And most journalists end up going either into public relations or the political consulting or different exit plans for journalists. But I felt that after my experience at NYU, that they're definitely, I much more preferred passing on the lessons and the skills of investigative journalism and of historical analysis that I had accumulated over the years. So I decided that it would probably be best for me if I was going to leave journalism to go into teaching journalism. And so I think that my experience at NYU, together with the previous experience at Brooklyn, was what convinced the folks at Rutgers University that I would be a good fit for how their journalism and media studies department. And so a couple of years after my NYU experience, Rutgers offered me a great opportunity. And I have now been, for the past 5 years, as I said, the professor of journalism and media studies, specifically geared toward investigative journalism, training a new generation of young people to dig deep, to question authority, to question official stories, and to try to get to the bottom of the news stories that appear on a daily basis here and around the world. One of the important lessons from not only from my time at NYU, but as we reflect on how the development of the Latino and Latinx community in the United States is first of all, the enormous growth of the population. We're talking now about 60 million people within the United States trace their heritage to Latin America. If you throw in the extra 3 million in Puerto Rico, which the Census Bureau never counts as part of the US population, we're talking about 63 million people. And it is a huge sector of the US population, and not just in a few cities like New York or in Florida or Texas or California, throughout the United States. Dodge City, Kansas, the iconic frontier city of the United States is now about 60% Latino. And you can go to Northern Arkansas, you can go to North Carolina, you can go to South Carolina or Georgia. The exploding populations in the public schools are of Latino children. So increasingly, the fact is that the country, no matter what the anti-immigrant restrictionist movement or efforts of any particular time, the long-time historical trend is that the United States is becoming increasingly Latinized, and it's increasingly more and more bigger percentage of the population traces its origins to Latin America. So that I think that the study of how that happened, the transformation of the United States, and not just the United States, this is a phenomena throughout the advanced industrial world, that the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the former colonial subjects of the imperial powers, have increasingly come to the West. France doesn't know what to do about all the Algerians and the Tunisians and the Moroccans. England doesn't know what to do about all the Indians and Pakistanis and Jamaicans. Germany doesn't know what to do about all the Turks. And Spain is grappling more and more with what to do about all the African immigrants that have come to Spain in recent years. The reality is that the colonial peoples migrated precisely to the nations that once dominated them. The reason there's so many Algerians and Tunisians and Moroccans in France is because those were the colonies of France. The reason there's so many Indians, Pakistanis, and Jamaicans in England is because those were the colonies of England. And the reason there are so many Latin Americans in the United States is because Latin America was the incubator of the United States worldwide empire. It was where the empire started. It started in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, in Central America, in Mexico, and then expanded to the rest of the world. So those of us who try to teach this historical lessons hopefully will dispel the ignorance and the hysteria over what is a world historical process that has been in development for centuries. And there's no policy is going to change the fact that more people are on the move in the world today from their former countries to another country than ever before. Because you cannot have a globalized capitalist system without having a globalized labor system. Labor and capital are two sides of the same coin. You can't tear down the barriers for capital, but erect barriers for labor. It won't work. And that's what we're seeing right now, not only in the United States, but in every advanced country in the world. Looking back, I want to especially thank NYU and the King Juan Carlos Center for the privilege of being able to spend some time with the students and faculty there at NYU. It was a wonderful experience, not the least of which was the fact that they provided me an apartment to be right down there next to the campus for a semester, and being able to enjoy the life of Greenwich Village and of the NYU environment. So I think that it was a wonderful experience, and I think I was able to provide some new insights for the students and the faculty that they otherwise would not have had. So I think it was beneficial for me, and it certainly was beneficial for the university. And I want to congratulate this center on its 25th anniversary.